On July 6, 2013, the serene skies over San Francisco were shattered when an Asiana Airlines Boeing 777 attempted to land but fell disastrously short. Descending too low and too slow, the massive aircraft clipped the seawall before careening onto the runway in a dramatic crash that sent it spinning nearly 360 degrees. In an instant, the scene transformed into chaos and resilience. Doors burst open, emergency slides deployed, and passengers poured out of the burning wreckage, clutching onto their incredible stories of survival. Tragically, three teenage girls from China lost their lives, two thrown from the plane during the violent rotation. The crash marked the end of the Boeing 777's unprecedented 18-year record of zero fatalities, capturing the world's attention and prompting a vital question. How could a modern jetliner, equipped with advanced automation and guided by experienced pilots, end up in such a catastrophic state? The answer was anything but straightforward. It lay in a complex web of factors: a trainee captain struggling to regain control of a faltering approach, miscommunications between pilots, and the challenges of navigating an increasingly automated cockpit. This tragedy not only exposed cracks in pilot training and the reliance on automation, but also sparked debates over the emergency response and broader issues in aviation safety. A decade later, the lessons of that fateful day continue to shape the narrative of air travel, reminding us that even in the most advanced aircraft, the human factor remains a critical piece of the puzzle. Founded in 1988, Asiana Airlines quickly established itself as a trailblazer in South Korea's aviation industry, becoming the nation's first independent airline. For decades, it has stood as the largest private competitor to the national flag carrier, Korean Air. Today, Asiana operates an extensive fleet, including 45 wide-body aircraft. Among them are 9 Boeing 777s, a number that has dwindled from 14 a decade ago. The Boeing 777, affectionately called the 777, is a marvel of engineering. As the largest twin-engine jet in the world, it can carry between 300 and 400 passengers depending on its configuration. Since its introduction in 1995, the 777 has become one of the most iconic and widely used wide-body airliners, with over 1,700 units delivered as of 2023. Its impeccable safety record once made it the gold standard of reliability, with 18 years of operation free from fatal accidents, until tragedy struck Asiana Airlines in 2013, breaking that unprecedented streak. On the ill-fated day of July 6, 2013, Asiana Flight 214, a regular overnight trans-Pacific route from Seoul to San Francisco, turned into a tragedy that reverberated across the aviation world. The aircraft, a Boeing 777-ER, was an unremarkable workhorse in the Asiana fleet, showing no prior signs of mechanical issues. For most of the nearly 11-hour journey, the flight proceeded smoothly, offering no indication of the chaos that would unfold during its final 5 minutes. The cockpit on Flight 214 was staffed by an augmented crew of 4 pilots and supported by 12 flight attendants. Leading the team was 49-year-old Captain Lee Jong-min, an experienced aviator with over 12,000 flight hours, including more than 3,000 on the Boeing 777. Recently promoted to instructor captain, this was his first flight mentoring another captain. Beside him sat 45-year-old Captain Lee Kang-kook, who had only recently transitioned to the 777 after years of flying the Airbus A320. Though he boasted over 9,600 hours of total flight time, his experience on the 777 was limited to just 43 hours. As part of his initial operating experience, IOE, a probationary training phase, Captain Lee Kang-kook was piloting the aircraft from the left seat while instructor Captain Lee provided oversight from the right. The route from Incheon International Airport to San Francisco International Airport, SFO, was a well-traveled one for Asiana Airlines, and the day's flight began routinely. The pilots monitored the plane's systems, navigated across the Pacific, and rotated through scheduled breaks. By all accounts, everything seemed ordinary until the aircraft began its descent into San Francisco. What followed was a catastrophic sequence of events shaped by a combination of pilot inexperience, miscommunication, and challenges in managing the Boeing 777's complex automation. The crash not only ended the Boeing 777's long-standing record of safety, but also brought renewed scrutiny to pilot training practices, the interplay between humans and automated systems, and the emergency response protocols at airports. A decade later, the lessons from Flight 214 remain central to discussions about how to ensure safer skies, reminding the world of the delicate balance between technology and human skill in aviation. With 291 passengers seated behind them, the two captains piloting Asiana Flight 214 smoothly handled the takeoff and the initial cruise phase of the 10-hour Trans-Pacific journey. Following protocol to avoid exceeding duty time limits, they eventually left the cockpit to rest in the business class cabin. Reclining in the plush seats, they might have blended in with the passengers around them, catching a few precious hours of sleep. Meanwhile, the flight deck came under the capable hands of the relief crew, 40-year-old Relief First Officer Bong Dong-wan and 52-year-old Relief Captain Lee Jong-ju, who took command during the middle portion of the flight. The cruise phase unfolded uneventfully, a testament to the reliability of the Boeing 777. Roughly 5 hours later, the original flight crew stirred from their slumber and began making their way back to the cockpit. Trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook, still in the midst of his initial operating experience training, was the first to return. Relief Captain Lee Jong-ju briefed him on the situation ahead. The approach into San Francisco International Airport's SFO runway 28 left would utilize only a localizer, as the glide slope was temporarily out of service. This information had been programmed into the plane's flight management computer and relayed during the crew's pre-flight briefing. Shortly thereafter, instructor Captain Lee Jong-min rejoined his trainee in the cockpit. By 9:55 a.m. Pacific time, the primary crew officially relieved their counterparts. As the flight neared San Francisco, Lee Kang-kook led a detailed approach briefing, emphasizing once more that the glide slope, a critical component of the Instrument Landing System, ILS, was unavailable. Typically, the ILS provides both lateral guidance via a localizer to align the plane with the runway and vertical guidance via a glide slope to maintain the ideal 3-degree descent angle. However, ongoing construction to expand runway overrun areas on 28 left and its parallel counterpart, 28 right, had temporarily removed the glide slope equipment. A Federal Aviation Administration FAA Notice to Airmen NOTAM had informed pilots about the outage, and this critical detail had been highlighted in Asiana's pre-flight materials. Despite the absence of the glide slope, conditions were ideal. Clear skies, unlimited visibility, and light winds made for a textbook summer day in San Francisco. With the localizer functioning and air traffic control expected to clear them for a visual approach, the crew anticipated a straightforward descent. Visual landings rely primarily on the pilot's judgment, aided by their view of the runway and the horizon. For a well-trained crew, the missing glide slope was merely a procedural inconvenience rather than a critical challenge. However, as history would show, a seemingly minor complication can set off a chain reaction of misjudgments and errors. The approach to Run 28 Left, while straightforward on paper, would soon become a case study in how human factors, automation, and momentary lapses can collide with devastating consequences. This brief window of calm would soon give way to one of the most significant aviation disasters in recent memory, forever altering the legacy of Asiana Airlines and the Boeing 777. Although visual approaches have long been considered a fundamental skill for pilots, trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The towering responsibility of guiding a Boeing 777 into one of the busiest airports in the United States weighed heavily on him. This was his first time landing in San Francisco and his first attempt at a visual approach in the 777 without the reassuring guidance of a glide slope, a maneuver he had practiced only in simulators. Nervousness gnawed at him, but he kept his concerns to himself. Admitting inexperience would be tantamount to confessing inadequacy, a vulnerability he wasn't willing to expose in front of his instructor or the crew. After all, wasn't it the instructor's job to catch any mistakes before they became critical? As the airplane crossed into the San Francisco Bay Area, the mood in the cockpit remained outwardly calm. The crew diligently ran through the descent checklist, verifying critical parameters. Among them was the landing reference speed, or VREF, which Lee Kang-kook confirmed at 132 knots, a number that would later take on ominous significance. Relief First Officer Bong Dong-wan soon rejoined the cockpit, ready to assist during the high-stakes approach. His role was to act as an extra set of eyes, ensuring that Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min could focus on mentoring rather than monitoring every detail of the descent. For now, though, everything appeared routine. The crew received progressive clearances to descend, and Flight 214 glided closer to the iconic city by the bay. Each passing second brought them closer to a confluence of events that would push their training, judgment, and composure to the limit. Descending through 6,300 feet, Flight 214 was finally in its critical approach phase. The airport was now in sight, and air traffic control granted the expected clearance for a visual approach to runway 28L. Moments later, the plane's systems locked onto the localizer signal, and the autopilot smoothly aligned the aircraft with the runway centerline. But for trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook, this was when the real test began, a high-stakes balancing act that had haunted him throughout his training. Managing the descent to the runway while reducing airspeed from 215 knots to a precise 137 knots, VREF +5, isn't just difficult, it's one of the most unforgiving challenges in piloting. Descending naturally increases airspeed, yet preparing for a safe landing demands that speed decrease. The conflicting demands create a razor-thin margin for error, especially in a complex aircraft like the Boeing 777. Adding to the difficulty, extending the flaps and landing gear further alters the plane's aerodynamic behavior, requiring constant adjustments to maintain control. Under normal circumstances, this would be the job of the 77's highly sophisticated systems during an ILS approach. With a functioning glide slope, the autopilot and autothrottle would handle every nuance of pitch and thrust to ensure the aircraft followed the optimal 3-degree descent path with pinpoint precision. But today, with the glide slope out of service due to runway construction, it was all up to the pilots. The absence of a glide slope left Lee Kang-kook with two options: rely entirely on his instincts and hand fly the approach visually, or use the plane's Mode Control Panel, MCP, to set specific targets for airspeed, descent rate, and altitude, letting the autopilot and autothrottle execute his commands. The MCP, while a powerful tool, demands a deep understanding of the 777's automation logic, a skill that Lee was still mastering. As the runway loomed closer, the pressure mounted. Every decision, every adjustment had to be perfect. With seconds ticking away, the challenge wasn't just about flying the plane. It was about staying ahead of it, anticipating its every move in a delicate dance of man and machine. The intricate dance between automation and human control in modern aircraft is driven by two critical systems: the autopilot and the autothrottle. These systems operate with a precision that can seem almost magical, yet their effectiveness relies entirely on the crew's understanding of their modes and behavior. The autopilot governs the aircraft's control surfaces to adjust pitch and roll, while the autothrottle regulates engine power. Together, they can be configured into various modes to achieve the parameters selected by the flight crew, but only if the pilots are constantly aware of which modes are engaged and why. In any given moment, the autopilot and autothrottle can operate in three concurrent modes: a lateral mode, which determines horizontal alignment, a vertical mode, which governs climb or descent, and an autothrottle mode, which adjusts engine thrust. While the lateral mode in this story, localizer Ella, guiding the plane toward the runway centerline, played no role in the unfolding tragedy, the vertical and autothrottle modes were poised to become decisive players in the drama. A closer look at the critical modes. 1. Vertical speed, VS. In this vertical mode, the autopilot pitches the nose of the aircraft up or down to achieve a descent or climb rate pre-selected by the crew in the Mode Control Panel, MCP. For instance, a setting of -1,000 feet per minute would prompt a steady descent. When VS mode is active, the autothrottle automatically switches to speed SPD mode, where it adjusts engine thrust to maintain a target airspeed also set in the MCP. To flight level change speed, FLCH-SPD, this mode emphasizes airspeed over altitude change. The autopilot adjusts pitch to maintain the target airspeed, pitching up to slow down or pitching down to accelerate. Simultaneously, the autothrottle switches to thrust THR mode increasing or decreasing thrust to assist with altitude changes. While FLCH SPD ensures the aircraft levels off at the designated altitude, the rate of climb or descent is not directly controlled, adding a layer of complexity for the crew. Number 3. Hold. A seemingly passive yet pivotal autothrottle mode, hold disconnects the autothrottle motor from the thrust levers, rendering it unable to adjust engine power. This mode engages automatically when pilots manually override the autothrottle by moving the thrust levers or when the thrust levers reach idle in FLCH SPD mode. In hold, the engines remain at their last commanded thrust setting until further pilot intervention. One more piece of this puzzle is the flight director, FD, a visual guide designed to assist pilots when the autopilot is disengaged. The FD projects target pitch and roll indicators on the attitude display, allowing pilots to manually replicate the autopilot's intended actions. Even with the autopilot off, the autothrottle can remain active in a mode like SPD, providing a layer of assistance. As Flight 214 descended toward San Francisco, these modes formed the unseen battlefield where automation and human judgment would collide. Misunderstanding or mismanaging them, even for a moment, could unleash cascading consequences, ones that would soon transform this routine approach into a nightmare scenario. At approximately 11:23 a.m. local time, the cockpit of Asiana Airlines Flight 214 was a hub of activity as the Boeing 777 descended through 5,300 feet, steadily approaching San Francisco International Airport. Inside, the calm professionalism of the crew belied the complex and high-stakes orchestration of systems at play. The vertical mode was set to FLCH SPD, guiding the plane downward toward a target altitude of 3,100 feet. The thrust levers rested at flight idle, leaving the autothrottle in hold mode, while the autopilot adjusted the plane's pitch to maintain the selected airspeed of 212 knots. Simultaneously, the lateral mode, set to lock, was steering the aircraft precisely toward the runway's localizer. So far, everything seemed to be running smoothly. But in aviation, even the most routine sequences can quickly take on a razor-edge tension. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min broke the relative quiet, suggesting, "Let's descend slowly to 1,800 feet." His statement referred to waypoint Dayet, located 5.4 nautical miles from the runway and serving as the final approach fix for an instrument approach to runway 28L. While they weren't required to cross Duyet at a specific altitude during this visual approach, aligning with the optimal 3-degree glide path to reach 1,800 feet at Duyet was an informal benchmark, a way to ensure they remained on course. Without hesitation, trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook adjusted the target altitude in the Mode Control Panel MCP to 1,800 feet. A seemingly minor change, but one requiring precise coordination between automation and human input. The descent continued, punctuated only by the hum of the engines and the focused exchanges of the crew. Moments later, the San Francisco approach controller's voice crackled over the radio, injecting a new variable into the equation. Asiana 214 Heavy, reduce speed to 180, maintain that till 5-mile final. There's traffic behind and to the right that does have you in sight. Acknowledging the instruction, Lee Kang-kook dialed the MCP airspeed down to 180 knots. The reduction demanded a delicate balance, slowing the aircraft while maintaining control over the descent. As the plane began bleeding off speed, he called for flaps to be extended to position 5, a critical step in preparing for landing. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min waited until the airspeed dipped below the maximum limit for the flap setting before smoothly extending them to 5 degrees. Each adjustment seemed minor, yet the stakes were anything but. With each passing second, the aircraft drew closer to the runway, and closer to the critical moments where a subtle misstep could tip the balance between a smooth landing and disaster. The stage was set, and every action from here on would become part of a story destined to be scrutinized for years to come. The first hints of trouble were beginning to emerge, subtle but telling, as Flight 214 continued its descent. When trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook reduced the target airspeed in the MCP to 180 knots, the autopilot, operating in FLCH-SPD mode, responded as designed. It began pitching the nose up to slow the plane down. But a critical limitation was already in play. The thrust levers were at flight idle, meaning there was no more engine power to cut, leaving the autothrottle unable to further assist in deceleration. The result? The descent rate flattened dramatically, dropping from manganese 900 feet per minute to a sluggish manganese 300 feet per minute. On the pilot's navigation displays, a concerning detail emerged. A predictive arc showed that the plane's descent path would overshoot the due yet waypoint, crossing it far above the desired altitude of 1,800 feet. The tension in the cockpit began to build. The crew now faced a predicament. Their current configuration, thrust idle, FLCH SPD mode, and an increasing pitch, was fundamentally incompatible with achieving the necessary descent. The solution, though straightforward, was overlooked: deploying the speed brakes. This action would have reduced lift and allowed the plane to descend more steeply. Yet no one reached for the lever. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min was the first to notice something amiss. Though his comment was garbled, its intent was clear, a signal to address the growing issue. Trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook, perhaps feeling the weight of his instructor's observation, responded with, "Yeah, I am descending now." His response seemed calm, but his actions spoke of urgency. He pressed the V button on the mode control panel, switching the vertical autopilot mode from FSPD to vertical speed VS. This adjustment allowed the autopilot to pitch the aircraft downward to increase the descent rate. Lee selected a target descent rate of MIGA's 1,000 feet per minute, and the autopilot responded immediately, adjusting the pitch to achieve it. Simultaneously, the autothrottle switched from hold to SPD mode, tasked with maintaining the target airspeed of 180 knots. But the situation didn't stabilize. With the thrust levers already idle, the autothrottle could not reduce airspeed any further. As the plane pitched down, airspeed stabilized, not at 180 knots, but at 185 knots. The target speed remained out of reach, and the interplay of systems created a precarious imbalance. The pilots, focused on correcting their descent, were likely unaware of how this unresolved issue would compound in the critical moments to come. What had started as a subtle misalignment in their descent was now setting the stage for a cascade of decisions and actions, each with less margin for error than the last. The tension in the cockpit began to mount as the seconds ticked by. Observer pilot Bong Dong-won, noticing a glaring discrepancy, broke the silence. 180 to 5 miles, he reminded, reiterating the air traffic controller's directive to maintain 180 knots until 5 miles from the runway. His words hung in the air, unanswered at first. Trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook seemed flustered, hesitating as if uncertain of the next step. Bong repeated the instruction, not once, but 3 more times before Lee finally acknowledged, "Okay, 180, 5 miles." Yet even then, his hesitation was palpable. For 13 agonizing seconds, he appeared to weigh his options before declaring, "Gear down, please." The deployment of the landing gear was a logical move. It would increase drag and help slow the plane to 180 knots. But by this point, the airspeed had crept up further, reaching 188 knots, and their descent path was veering even further above the target altitude. The situation was rapidly becoming untenable. A descent rate of -1,000 feet per minute was no longer sufficient to bring the plane back on track. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min, sensing the urgency, broke his silence. "It seems a little high." "Yeah," Lee Kang-kook agreed, his voice taut. "This should be a bit high," Jong-min reiterated, his tone carrying an edge of unease. "Do you mean it's too high?" Kang-kook asked, his question almost rhetorical. The answer was obvious, but the growing disconnect between intention and action was ominous. Jong-min's response was unintelligible, but its urgency was clear. Kang-kook reacted, announcing, "I will descend more," and adjusted the mode control panel, MCP, increasing the target vertical speed to 9,500 feet per minute. The autopilot complied instantly, pitching the plane steeper into its descent. At last, there was progress. The plane dipped back toward the optimal 3-degree glide path, and with the landing gear deployed, airspeed finally dropped to the target 180 knots. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the crew had regained control, but the reprieve was short-lived. 27 seconds later, Lee Jong-min's voice cut through again. 1,000, he said, marking the altitude aloud. Interpreting this as a signal, Lee Kang-kook adjusted the MCP once more, dialing back the vertical speed to -1,000 feet per minute. Perhaps he thought the plane was now perfectly aligned with the glide path, and such a steep descent was no longer necessary. It was a grave miscalculation. As the descent rate slowed, the aircraft once again began to drift above the 3-degree glide path. What had seemed like a recovery was unraveling. Each correction came too late, each decision layered uncertainty atop an already fragile situation. The margin for error was shrinking rapidly, and the critical moment was fast approaching. At that critical moment, as the plane descended through 3,000 feet, the tension in the cockpit was palpable. The approach controller transferred Flight 214 to the tower for landing clearance, and trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook called out, "Missed approach 3000." His voice betrayed a mix of focus and unease as he referenced their briefing, recalling that 3,000 feet was the altitude they'd climb to if the approach failed. He adjusted the target MCP altitude accordingly, setting it for an automatic climb in case the autopilot's go-around toga mode was engaged. But with the current vertical mode set to vertical speed, VS, the selection lay dormant, ready but unusable without a mode change. Moments later, just before 11:26, Flight 214 crossed the due waypoint at 2,250 feet, 450 feet too high. The discrepancy was glaring, and their shallow descent rate made it impossible to regain the optimal glide path in time. The runway loomed closer, and the pressure mounted. Seeking to correct their trajectory, Lee Kang-kook ordered the flaps extended to 20 degrees and adjusted the target MCP speed to 152 knots, hoping to slow the plane enough to deploy further flaps. The seconds ticked by, and he quickly called for flaps 30. But Lee Jong-min, ever vigilant, interjected, "Speed check flaps 30, sir." His reminder was firm, yet urgent. At 174 knots, they were still too fast. The maximum speed for flaps 30 was 170 knots. The cracks in their coordination widened. The plane was descending too slowly, flying too high, and still moving too fast. Problems were stacking up rapidly, and Lee Kang-kook faced a dire question. How could he salvage the approach? In truth, his options were limited, but clear. He could have executed a missed approach, climbing to 3,000 feet to reset for another attempt, safer, slower, and more controlled. Alternatively, he could have tried to regain control by deploying the speed brakes to steepen the descent while selecting a higher vertical speed in the MCP. Either option would have offered a chance to stabilize the situation, but under the weight of rising tension, Lee Kang-kook made a baffling decision. He reached up to the MCP and switched the autopilot's vertical mode to flight level change speed, FLCH SPD. For those familiar with the logic of this mode, the choice defied reason. Why? If you're intrigued by a mental challenge, consider the mechanics of FLCH SPD and try to unravel the disastrous consequences that would inevitably follow. What was meant to be a corrective move was, in reality, a setup for even greater chaos. The problem with selecting FLCH SPD mode became evident almost immediately. This mode caused the autothrottle to increase thrust in an effort to climb toward the target altitude of 3,000 feet, an altitude that trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook himself had preemptively set in case of a missed approach. Simultaneously, the autopilot began pitching the nose up to decelerate to the target airspeed of 152 knots, as programmed in the MCP. The result? The plane started to level off, dangerously abandoning its descent, and would have initiated a climb had the trainee captain not intervened in time. For a few tense seconds, Lee Kang-kook seemed oblivious to the issue. He repeated his call for flaps 30, focusing on flap configuration rather than the aircraft's unexpected behavior. But the looming discrepancy couldn't escape notice for long. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min, alert to the situation, sharply called out, "Sir," breaking the growing tension and pointing out the anomaly. Realizing the gravity of the error, Lee Kang-kook acted swiftly. He disconnected the autopilot, halting the plane's upward pitch. The autopilot status enunciation changed from AP, autopilot, to FLT DIR, flight director, signaling manual control of the flight's trajectory. Not stopping there, he reached for the thrust levers, pulling them back to idle in an effort to arrest the acceleration caused by the autothrottle's earlier command. This action triggered a new complication, placing the autothrottle into hold mode. In this mode, the autothrottle disengages entirely from controlling thrust, awaiting manual reactivation or a new mode input. Crucially, neither pilot seemed to recognize this critical shift in autothrottle behavior. Instead of acknowledging the mode change, Lee Kang-kook merely noted flight director, indicating awareness of the autopilot's status but missing the more pressing issue. The situation grew precarious. With the autothrottle in hold mode, it would not adjust thrust to maintain their desired airspeed. Normally, FLCH SPD mode would resolve this automatically upon reaching the target altitude, but the autopilot was no longer in control. The aircraft's speed now depended entirely on pilot intervention, a fact neither seemed fully attuned to. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min, sensing the escalating stakes, called out, "Speed." Lee Kang-kook responded promptly, "Target speed 137, referencing the optimal final approach speed of ref plus 5 knots. He adjusted the MCP airspeed setting to 137 knots, but the effort was futile. With the autothrottle locked in hold mode, the target speed became little more than a suggestion, displayed on the MCP but ignored by the systems that could make it a reality. The pilots were now locked in a precarious race against time, fighting to regain control of their speeding descent toward the runway. The tension in the cockpit was palpable as the plane hurtled toward its final moments. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min's voice cut through the hum of the engines. "It's high," he noted, his tone calm but edged with concern. Seconds later, as the altimeter ticked past 1,000 feet, he announced, 1,000. Trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook, sensing the pressure, pushed the descent aggressively, driving the plane into a steep 9 at 1,800 feet per minute descent, well above the airline's safety limit of minus 1,000 feet per minute, below 1,000 feet. Observer pilot Bong Dong-wan didn't hesitate. "Sink rate, sir," he called, a sharp reminder of their breach in protocol. "Yes, sir," Lee Kang-kook replied tersely, his focus unwavering as he fought to wrestle the plane back onto the correct glide path. On the radio, Lee Jong-min reported their position to the tower. "Tower, Asiana 214, short final." His voice carried a practiced calm, but the situation was teetering on the edge of control. The rapid descent worked momentarily. At 500 feet, the plane's trajectory aligned with the optimal 3-degree glide path, and the automated voice announced, 500. "Landing checklist," Lee Kang-kook ordered. "Landing checklist complete, cleared to land," Lee Jong-min responded. "On glide path, sir." The words were meant to reassure, but they masked a deeper truth. It was Lee Jong-min's duty as the non-flying pilot to ensure the approach was stabilized, criteria that demanded a steady glide path, proper airspeed, a configured landing setup, and minimal control adjustments. On the surface, the flight seemed to meet these requirements. They were on the glide path, decelerated to 137 knots, and in full landing configuration. But the facade of control was dangerously thin. The sink rate remained excessive, demanding continuous major adjustments to keep from dropping too fast. Worse, the thrust levers sat idly at idle power, a fatal oversight given the drag from the flaps and landing gear. At this stage of the descent, thrust should have been increased to around 50% to maintain speed and altitude. Normally, the autothrottle would have compensated, but it remained stuck in hold mode, oblivious to their desperate need for thrust. This approach was anything but stable, and by all safety protocols, it should have been aborted. Yet neither Lee Jong-min nor Lee Kang-kook grasped the gravity of their predicament. Instead, they pressed on, oblivious to the catastrophic trajectory leading them to the ground just short of the runway. "Sink rate, sir," Bong Dong-wan warned again, his voice growing more urgent. "Cleared to land?" Lee Jong-min asked, as if reassurance could undo the peril. "Sink rate," another voice echoed in alarm. The radio crackled as the tower chimed in. "Asiana 214 Heavy, San Francisco Tower, runway 28 left, cleared to land." "Cleared to land 28 left, Asiana 214, Lee Jong-min acknowledged, his tones steady but blind to the unraveling disaster. With each passing second, the ground loomed closer. The runway stretched ahead, tantalizingly within reach. But their approach was a silent storm of errors and overlooked warnings. Time was slipping away, and with it, their chance to avert the inevitable. Lee Kang-kook's aggressive descent had brought the plane tantalizingly close to the proper 3-degree glide path. For a fleeting moment, it seemed they were on course to a smooth landing. At 500 feet, the automated voice broke the silence. 500. "Landing checklist," Kang-kook commanded, his voice steady but taut with focus. Landing checklist complete, cleared to land. Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min replied. He added reassuringly, "On glide path, sir." The phrase hung in the air, a declaration of order that masked the growing chaos. By now, it was Jong-min's duty as the non-flying pilot to verify their approach was stabilized, aligned with the glide path, at the correct airspeed, fully configured for landing, and requiring no drastic inputs. On the surface, everything seemed aligned. The flaps and gear were down, the airspeed hovered at 137 knots, and the PAPI lights confirmed they were tracking the glide slope. But underneath, the approach was unraveling. Their sink rate was dangerously steep, well beyond the minus 1,000 feet per minute limit allowed at this altitude. Worse, the thrust levers remained at idle, leaving the engines powerless to counteract the drag from the extended landing gear and flaps. At this stage, a thrust setting near 50% was vital to stabilize their descent and maintain speed, but the autothrottle, stuck in hold mode, provided no assistance. The illusion of control was just that, an illusion. The situation demanded a go-around, a decisive break from their trajectory to regroup and try again. But neither pilot recognized the peril they were in. Their focus remained narrowly fixed on landing, as the aircraft's conditions silently betrayed them. Oblivious to the mounting danger, they pressed on, unaware they were on a collision course with the ground, far short of the runway. The warning signs were there, flashing like neon in a storm, but the pilots, locked in their routines, failed to see them for what they were: the prelude to disaster. Trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook eased the control column back, attempting to slow their descent. Yet the airspeed betrayed him, slipping below the critical target of 137 knots. The plane, starved of the power needed to hold the 3-degree glide path, began to sag below it. On the PAPI, the runway's visual warning system, the lights shifted ominously. 2 white and 2 red turned to 1 white and 3 red. They were low. Kang-kook, desperate to correct, pitched the nose higher. But the higher the nose climbed, the more the airspeed crumbled. The plane teetered at the edge of control, his mind racing with unspoken dread. The 4 red light warning loomed, a signal of imminent failure and, worse yet, a potential reprimand from management. What was he doing wrong? Why wasn't the plane responding? 200, the automated voice chimed, cold and clinical. The plane limped forward, its airspeed now a perilous 122 knots, 10 knots below the minimum safe landing speed. They were descending at 900 feet per minute, their nose pitched unnaturally high at over 7 degrees. Ahead, the runway still lay a mile away, but the PAPI's lights gave their final verdict: 4 red. Dangerously low. Kang-kook's reflexes took over, pulling the nose even higher in a last-ditch effort to climb. But the physics were unforgiving. Without the necessary speed, the aircraft couldn't generate lift. From the right seat, Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min scanned the instruments, his gaze snapping to the airspeed indicator. The reading chilled him: 120 knots. Far too slow. His mind wrestled with the inconsistency. Why hadn't the autothrottle engaged to maintain their speed at 137 knots? Was it malfunctioning? The realization struck him with a pang of urgency. "It's low," he called out, his voice laced with restrained tension. "Yeah," Kang-kook muttered, his own focus tunnel-visioned on the sinking plane. Yet neither man moved to advance the thrust levers. A warning chime shattered the cockpit's fragile, blaring its quadruple note of alarm. Their speed had plummeted further, now only 114 knots. Altitude 124 feet, sink rate 600 feet per minute. And still the runway stretched a daunting half-mile ahead. 100, the automated voice intoned. Jong-min snapped into action. "Speed!" he shouted, his voice breaking through the haze of inertia. Realizing the criticality of their situation, he lunged for the thrust levers, shoving them to maximum power. The engines roared in protest, the cabin quaking under the sudden surge. In the passenger section, cries of alarm rippled as the runway's approach lights streaked past the windows, far closer than they should have been. Outside, the waters of San Francisco Bay loomed large, rising to meet them. The nose pitched high, the engines screamed at full thrust, and still the ground rushed up. The realization hit both pilots at the same time. There was no escaping it now. They were going to crash. The realization hit the cockpit like a thunderclap. An automated voice declared, 50. but the airspeed had plunged to a chilling 103 knots. The stick shaker rattled violently, screaming a stall warning as the engines clawed desperately to regain power. Outside, the Boeing 777 hung precariously in the air, its nose pitched a startling 12 degrees up, teetering on the brink of disaster. From the terminal windows and shoreline, onlookers froze in shock. Even the untrained could see the truth. The aircraft was in grave peril. 40-30, the automated system intoned, oblivious to the chaos unfolding. "Oh shit, go around!" Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. 20! Go around, Lee Kang-kook echoed, his words hollow against the inevitability of their fate. 10. The next moment was apocalyptic. At 106 knots, the plane's tail, hanging dangerously low, clipped the bay's surface like erupting in a massive plume of water that swallowed the rear windows. The collision with the 3-meter-high stone seawall was instant and catastrophic. The tail crumpled like paper, torn violently from the fuselage. Inside, passengers were thrown forward in an eruption of chaos as the nose slammed onto the runway, collapsing the landing gear with a deafening crunch. The 777 skidded forward, engines grinding against asphalt and scattering debris in a choking storm of dust and shattered metal. The left wing snagged on an unseen obstruction, jerking the entire aircraft into a surreal pirouette. Onlookers gaped in horror as the massive plane spun nearly 360 degrees, the fuselage lifting precariously into the air before crashing back to the ground with an earth-shaking impact. A dense cloud of smoke and dust swallowed the wreckage as the battered plane slid sideways across the grass bordering runway 28L. When it finally came to a halt, upright but grotesquely deformed, silence fell. A silence heavy with disbelief. Against all odds, the broken aircraft, its tail gone and its body scarred, sat still, as if stunned by its own survival. The moments following the crash were a blur of shock and chaos. Inside the battered fuselage, passengers and crew began to stir, slowly realizing they had survived the nightmarish descent, though many bore the marks of their ordeal, from minor scrapes to severe injuries. In the cockpit, the pilots, bruised and disoriented but alive, fumbled to assess their situation. Emergency power was still operational, and Instructor Captain Lee Jong-min reached for the radio, his voice unsteady as he called, "Asiana 214." The sentence trailed off, unfinished, swallowed by the weight of the disaster. The tower responded swiftly. "Asiana 214, emergency vehicles are responding," the controller assured, his voice calm but edged with urgency. From their vantage point, the air traffic controllers had witnessed the crash in gut-wrenching detail. Long before the plane skidded to a halt, someone had slammed the crash alarm, summoning fire and rescue teams in a blaring Alert 3 notification. The airport's fire crews were already racing toward the scene, but precious minutes would pass before they arrived. Until then, the crew and passengers were on their own. Inside the cabin, the reality of the situation was stark. The lead flight attendant pushed through the chaos to the cockpit, asking urgently if they should begin evacuation. The pilots hesitated, insisting they needed confirmation from air traffic control about the condition of the aircraft. But the cabin told a different story. Doors R1 and R2 on the right side had malfunctioned disastrously. Their emergency escape slides had deployed inward, trapping the attendants stationed there. At R1, one attendant was crushed against the wall, unconscious, while at R2A, another's legs were pinned painfully against the galley structure. Her screams echoed through the cabin, slicing through the din of panicked voices and groaning metal. Flight attendant L2A, stationed across the aisle, rushed to her aid. But as he crouched to help, something outside the window caught his eye. Smoke, thick and unmistakable, curling from the mangled wing. Flames licked hungrily at the ruptured fuel lines. His breath caught, and a chilling realization gripped him. They were running out of time. Acting on instinct, he abandoned his attempts to free his colleague and grabbed the intercom. His voice, steady despite the terror gripping him, rang out through the cabin. "Evacuate! Evacuate! Evacuate!" The order sent a ripple of motion through the stunned passengers, transforming confusion into action. The race to escape the smoldering wreckage had begun. The fire's origin was grimly clear. The Norner 2 engine had broken free during the crash, smashing into the right side of the fuselage. Its oil tank had ruptured, igniting a blaze that licked hungrily at the plane's battered hull. If the flames reached the cabin, or worse, the fuel tanks, the disaster would escalate beyond imagination. Time was their enemy, and the evacuation order had set a race for survival into motion. On the left side of the plane, the L1 and L2 doors were opened roughly 90 seconds after the aircraft screeched to a stop. The slides deployed with a hiss, unfurling lifelines for passengers to tumble down, some limping, some sprinting, all desperate to escape. But the scene farther back was a grimmer tableau. The L4 door and much of the tail section was gone, ripped away along with the seats and the four aft flight attendants. They were nowhere to be seen, lost to the chaos. At L3, the flight attendant battled the door but found it hopelessly jammed. Across the aisle, the R3 flight attendant was gravely injured, unable to help. A passenger, summoning courage amidst the bedlam, managed to wrench the R3 door open, allowing passengers to spill out into the open. Others, undeterred by the dangling debris and sparking wires, scrambled through the gaping hole where the tail had been. Outside, the first fire trucks roared onto the scene, their sirens barely audible over the screams and shouts of escaping passengers. The crews maneuvered around clusters of survivors, their hoses poised to combat the spreading inferno. Meanwhile, near the wreckage, frantic efforts were underway to rescue the trapped. The R2 slide, grotesquely inflated inside the cabin, had pinned one flight attendant against the galley. Crew members and passengers joined forces, but the slide was impenetrable. A desperate plea for help reached the firefighters. They needed something sharp to deflate it. Before assistance arrived, the lead flight attendant seized a knife from the galley, plunging it into the slide. With a loud hiss, the trapped R2A flight attendant was finally freed. At the R1 door, a more personal drama unfolded. The unconscious R1 flight attendant, crushed against the wall by the misfired slide, was being rescued by a small group of passengers, including her husband, who had been traveling as a passenger. Each second felt like an eternity as they worked to clear the obstacle. Finally, after a grueling struggle, the slide was pushed aside, and she was lifted from the wreckage. Her limp body was carried out by those who refused to leave her behind, their resolve unshaken even in the face of the encroaching flames. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but hope clung to those still fighting amidst the chaos. The cabin was nearly empty now, with smoke twisting ominously through the shattered aisles, curling around overturned seats. Toward the back, however, the L3 flight attendant was still fighting against time and rising panic. The injured R3 flight attendant had just been carried out through the exit by a handful of brave passengers, but L3's sharp eyes caught movement. 4, maybe 6 passengers still slumped in their seats, too injured or dazed to move. She pushed forward, coughing against the thickening smoke, trying desperately to free them. The walls of the plane seemed to close in as the air grew hotter and more toxic. Then salvation appeared. A group of firefighters and police officers emerged through the gaping hole in the rear of the plane, their figures silhouetted against the flickering flames outside. Armed with tools and sheer determination, they worked alongside L3, freeing the remaining passengers one by one. The danger was palpable. Sections of the cabin were beginning to catch fire, the orange glow inching closer with every passing second. Finally, as flames licked the overhead bins, the last passenger was pulled from the wreckage, exactly 19 harrowing minutes after the crash. But as the first responders retreated to safety, grim reality began to set in. Not everyone had escaped the doomed aircraft. Amid the confusion and chaos, it became clear that 2 passengers were still unaccounted for. A pair of Chinese high school students traveling with their group to attend a summer camp in the United States. The students had been seated together in the final rows, along with their classmate in seat 41G, who now stood outside, shaken but alive. She reported the terrible truth. Wang Linjia, seated in 41D, and Ye Mengyuan in 41E were missing. The details of their disappearance were chilling. According to the survivor in 41G, Ye Mengyuan had not been wearing her seatbelt during landing, while Wang Linjia, curled beneath a blanket, may also have been unbuckled. Though the flight attendants had performed the required seatbelt checks before descent, it was unclear whether the girls had been overlooked or had unfastened their belts after inspection. As inexperienced flyers, they likely didn't grasp the gravity of following such safety measures. The survivor's voice trembled as she described the chaos, how the violent crash had thrown her friends from their seats, hurling them into the unknown. The truth lingered in the smoky air. Somewhere in the wreckage or beyond, two young lives hung in the balance, and no one yet knew if rescue would come too late. The crew's anxiety had shifted into a desperate search for their missing colleagues. Four flight attendants stationed in the aft galley in jump seats R4, L4, M4A, and M4B were unaccounted for. Where their section of the fuselage once was, there now yawned a gaping void, ripped open by the violent impact. Despite the chaos, word of the missing crew eventually reached the fire crews, but confusion reigned. Mutual aid units from the San Francisco Fire Department, was now managing the scene, were led by a commander unfamiliar with airport protocols. Misunderstanding the term cabin crew as referring to pilots, the lead firefighter ordered a search of the cockpit instead of the debris-strewn runway behind the aircraft, the most likely location of the missing attendants. 20 agonizing minutes after the crash, hope finally flickered. Out of the smoky haze and scattered wreckage, a figure emerged. R4's flight attendant, alive but visibly battered, limping across the runway. Several passengers spotted them and rushed to assist as the attendant collapsed at the edge of the grass. Emergency first aid was quickly administered, sparking a renewed urgency to scour the debris field. The vast expanse was littered with fragments of the plane, passenger baggage, engine parts, and shards of unrecognizable metal. Amid this carnage, firefighters located the remaining three flight attendants. Miraculously, all had survived, though their injuries were severe. Two remained strapped to their jump seats, while another had been hurled onto the unforgiving asphalt. The relief of these discoveries was tragically overshadowed by the somber sight of 16-year-old Wang Linjia's lifeless body. Ejected from the rear of the plane during its violent pirouette, she had been thrown into the wreckage and killed instantly, a heartbreaking end to her journey. But the mystery of Ye Mengyuan's fate would haunt the aftermath of the crash. She had been discovered much earlier, her body lying eerily still near the left wing, curled into a fetal position. With no visible signs of life, two firefighters declared her obviously deceased and directed fire trucks around her rather than stopping to render aid. As firefighting foam blanketed the area, obscuring her form, a devastating misstep unfolded. Approximately 22 minutes after the crash, Rescue 10, an airport fire truck outfitted with specialized tools, rolled over her at slow speed. Unnoticed, her body was struck again minutes later by another vehicle, Rescue 37. The unanswered question of whether Ye Mengyuan succumbed to the crash or the fire truck would ignite a storm of controversy. Investigators, attorneys, and the public would later probe this tragic miscalculation, grappling with the gut-wrenching possibility that her life might have been spared. The grim toll of the crash began with the tragic loss of Wang Linjia and Ye Mengyuan, but the shadow of death would stretch further still. 6 days after the crash, Liu Yipeng, a 15-year-old girl from the same school group, succumbed to her injuries. Seated in 42A, Liu's fate was sealed by the violent detachment of the L4 emergency exit door, which struck her during the chaos. Initially found unresponsive in the mangled cabin, she was rushed to the hospital, clinging to life in a coma, her parents by her side. Despite all efforts, the severe traumatic brain injury proved insurmountable. She passed away quietly in her hospital bed, leaving her grieving family to mourn another young life lost. The deaths of three teenagers cast a pall over what might otherwise have been heralded as a miracle of survival. Against all odds, 304 of the 307 passengers and crew endured the disaster, with 117 walking away entirely unscathed. The toll on the crew was particularly harsh. 8 of the 16 crew members suffered serious injuries, alongside 41 passengers, though all would eventually recover. Amid the devastation, credit was due to the resilience of the Boeing 777. Despite being hurled through the air with terrifying force, the aircraft's structure held together, sparing its occupants from the catastrophic breakup that has claimed lives in so many past crashes. Even more remarkable, the fuel tanks remained intact, preventing a catastrophic explosion. Though parts of the cabin were consumed by fire, the absence of a fuel-fed blaze allowed precious time for evacuation. saving countless lives. Investigators noted that survival was no mere stroke of luck, it was the result of decades of progress in aviation safety. Improvements in crashworthiness, particularly advancements in passenger seat design during the 1980s and 1990s, played a pivotal role. Unlike older accidents, where seats often broke free, becoming deadly projectiles, nearly every seat on the 777 remained securely anchored to the floor. This structural integrity ensured that despite the chaos and destruction, hundreds of lives were spared, underscoring how far technology and safety standards had come in safeguarding passengers against even the most harrowing of scenarios. The investigation into the crash unfolded like the opening act of a high stakes detective thriller. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, was immediately inundated with frantic phone calls from witnesses who had seen the disaster firsthand. Some callers were hysterical, their accounts disjointed and frantic, while others struggled to describe the surreal scene they had just witnessed. At first, the NTSB wasn't even certain what had occurred, but a quick call to San Francisco International Airport, initially met with an ominous busy signal, left no doubt that something catastrophic had happened. Moments later, the first television images began to filter in, stark and shocking, showing the smoking wreckage of the once pristine Boeing 77. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This was the first fatal crash of the widely celebrated Boeing 7777, an aircraft long regarded as a pinnacle of safety and engineering. The NTSB acted with urgency, assembling a formidable investigative team and descending en masse upon the chaotic crash site. The scene was both surreal and sobering. At one end lay the charred remnants of the aircraft, while a trail of debris stretched across the runway, telling a story of desperation and destruction. From the outset, one critical fact was inescapable. The plane had come in far too low. Witness after witness corroborated this, their testimonies echoed by damning security camera footage. Slowly but methodically, investigators began piecing together the puzzle. Black box recordings and interviews with the surviving pilots added layers of clarity, and the NTSB painstakingly reconstructed the chain of events that had led to the tragedy. At the heart of the mystery lay a grim truth. The crash had been caused by insufficient airspeed during the final approach. The trainee captain, Lee Kang-kook, had been unable to keep the aircraft on the standard 3-degree glide path, a failure that could have been avoided if the plane had been flying at its target speed. The ultimate culprit? The auto-throttle system. It had failed to increase thrust to maintain the programmed speed, and the pilots, distracted or unaware, had not intervened until it was far too late. The NTSB now had their answer, but the investigation was far from over. As they prepared to dive deeper into why the autothrottle had failed and why the pilots hadn't acted in time, one thing was already clear. This was a crash born not of a single mistake, but of a cascade of failures, each compounding the other, in a chilling ballet of human and technical error. The ill-fated sequence of decisions began the moment trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook allowed the massive jet to drift above the glide path after aligning with the runway. The initial misstep seemed small, a misjudgment in leaving the vertical mode set to FLCH SPD for too long. But aviation, much like a tightly wound clock, can unravel disastrously with even a single gear out of place. When Lee finally switched to VS mode, which is better suited for steep descents, it was already too late. Now tasked with the notoriously tricky job of descending back onto the glide path from above, Lee appeared hesitant, uncertain of his next move. Opportunities to correct course came and went, but Lee seemed paralyzed by the plane's high speed and altitude, only capable of addressing one problem at a time. The speed brakes, a critical tool for such a situation, remained untouched. When he finally realized he needed to descend faster, his choice of action was baffling. He switched back to FLCH SPD mode. Under the circumstances, it was the worst possible decision. FLCH SPD, designed for climbing or level flight adjustments, was not suited for the rapid descent required. Worse, Lee had already set the MCP altitude to 3,000 feet, a precaution for a potential go-around. In doing so, he inadvertently set the plane on a course to climb, not descend, when LCH SPD was activated. Realizing his error, Lee disengaged the autopilot, a move that should have been his first course of action. But even this choice carried consequences. His manual override triggered the autothrottle to switch into hold mode, effectively locking the thrust levers in place. Crucially, Lee never noticed this shift. Now flying manually, Lee extended more high-drag devices to aid the descent and managed to bring the plane back to the glide path. But the correction was executed with excessive zeal, causing the aircraft to slip below the glide slope. In a desperate attempt to recover, Lee pitched the nose up sharply. This maneuver proved catastrophic. The aggressive pitch up caused airspeed to plummet, a critical red flag ignored in the chaos of the moment. As the plane's descent continued unchecked, both speed and altitude drained away like sand through an hourglass. The final moments unfolded with brutal inevitability. The airspeed was too low, the altitude insufficient, and the pilots too overwhelmed to recover. The aircraft, caught in a deadly spiral of miscalculated decisions, struck the ground with devastating force. The interrogation room buzzed with the quiet hum of tension as trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook explained his bewilderment to the NTSB investigators. His voice, tinged with frustration and confusion, recounted how he had trusted the autothrottle system to safeguard the plane's airspeed, a belief that had betrayed him in the most critical moment. He expected the system to maintain the target MCP airspeed, no matter the mode. More so, he was convinced that even if the autothrottle failed, the plane would not decelerate below a dangerous threshold. In his mind, the amber low-speed caution zone on the airspeed indicator served as a failsafe. If the airspeed dipped too low, the autothrottle would wake up, automatically adding thrust. His confidence wasn't without precedent. Lee had drawn parallels to Airbus's Alpha Floor protection, a seemingly infallible system that prevents speeds from dropping into perilous zones. But the Boeing 777's design wasn't as forgiving. As the investigators pressed for details, the reality emerged like a jagged shard. While the 77 had a low-speed protection system, its design harbored exceptions, the kind that made it useless when the plane needed it most. The investigators dissected the system's nuances with surgical precision. The protection was programmed to activate if the airspeed dropped at least 8 knots below VREF for more than a second. But there were conditions. The feature didn't work below 400 feet on takeoff, below 100 feet on landing, or in specific autopilot modes. And the fatal flaw? It was entirely disabled when the autothrottle was in hold mode. In hold mode, the system effectively disengaged from the thrust levers, leaving no automated mechanism to intervene as the plane slowed to catastrophic speeds. The investigators' grim realization deepened when they probed Asiana Airlines training practices. Neither Lee Kang-kook nor his instructor, Captain Lee Jong-min, had been taught about these exceptions. The revelation felt like a betrayal of their trust in the system, a crack in the foundation of their training. When questioned, 5 Asiana instructor captains were asked to explain when the autothrottle's low-speed protection wouldn't work. 4 answered correctly, but admitted that they hadn't internalized this detail until after the accident. The 5th confessed complete ignorance. The roots of the oversight stretched back to Asiana's Boeing 777 training course. Trainees, including Lee Kang-kook, had witnessed the low-speed protection in action during simulations. They watched in awe as the autothrottle engaged to rescue the plane from a perilous slowdown, leaving an indelible impression. But the instructors never mentioned the critical caveat: the protection wouldn't engage in hold mode. For Lee, this omission turned what could have been a moment of correction into a fatal oversight. Had he known about the exceptions, Lee Kang-kook might have been more vigilant, monitoring the autothrottle and airspeed with the meticulousness the situation demanded. Instead, his faith in a system he barely understood led him into a trap, a tragic reminder of how incomplete knowledge can turn confidence into catastrophe. The trail of clues led investigators to a shadowy yet all too familiar adversary: fatigue. Missed callouts, an inability to grasp repeated warnings, and forgetting that the MCP go-around altitude had already been set, each misstep bore the telltale fingerprints of an exhausted mind. It wasn't surprising, given the grueling demands of a trans-Pacific flight. Trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook, with only sporadic rest on board, was not operating at full capacity. But fatigue was only one piece of a larger, troubling puzzle. As investigators sifted through the sequence of events, a sobering portrait of Lee Kang-kook began to emerge. This was a pilot thrust into a situation far beyond his experience, struggling to control a plane he barely knew. With just 43 hours logged on the Boeing 777, his lack of familiarity with the aircraft's quirks and automation systems was glaring. Surveys had shown that most pilots only become comfortable with new equipment after months of practice, far more time than Lee had been afforded. Yet, as the NTSB's analysis deepened, it became clear that experience alone wasn't the issue. The approach to San Francisco International Airport on that day was far from extraordinary. While the plane had started a bit high and fast, this was common at SFO, and dozens of other flights had managed it without incident. The weather was pristine, the winds light, and the localizer had already guided the plane neatly onto the runway's center line. A specialized vertical path indicator on the pilot's navigation displays depicted the ideal glide path as a simple 3-degree descent. In short, the approach demanded precision, not heroics. Yet Lee Kang-kook faltered. The reason, investigators realized, lay in the intricate art of energy management, balancing forward speed, vertical descent, and thrust to maintain a steady glide path. This isn't a skill pilots are born with, it's one honed through rigorous practice, but a growing body of evidence suggested that such foundational skills were atrophying across the aviation industry. In the years leading up to the crash, reports warned of pilots becoming over-reliant on automation, a trend exacerbated by airline policies that actively discouraged manual flying. Asiana Airlines was no exception. Pilots were encouraged to lean heavily on the plane's automated systems, even during ideal flying conditions. Lee Kang-kook himself had never flown a visual approach in a real Boeing 777 without glide slope equipment to guide him. While some airlines gave their crews the freedom to disconnect the autopilot and hone manual flying skills on clear, calm days, Asiana took the opposite approach. This policy, though well-intentioned, came at a steep cost. It left pilots ill-prepared for situations where automation couldn't be relied upon. When the crew of Flight 214 suddenly found themselves forced to control their descent manually, they were effectively flying blind, not because they lacked instruments, but because they lacked the practice. In this critical moment, the years of deferred skill building came back to haunt them, turning what should have been a routine approach into a fatal disaster. The spotlight of the investigation didn't linger solely on trainee Captain Lee Kang-kook. The actions or inactions of instructor Captain Lee Jong-min were scrutinized just as closely. The NTSB's findings revealed a series of missteps that, while perhaps understandable under the circumstances, offered a cautionary tale for any instructor pilot. Lee Jong-min, too, was battling the effects of fatigue. It was his first time instructing a trainee captain on a live line flight, and he was still calibrating how much oversight such a situation demanded. Unfortunately, his level of supervision proved insufficient, with gaps in judgment and reaction that contributed to the unfolding disaster. From the outset, Lee Jong-min's confidence in his trainee set the stage for complacency. By his own account, he was satisfied with Lee Kang-kook's handling of the climb and cruise phases of the flight. This misplaced assurance caused him to lower his guard as they approached San Francisco, a critical juncture demanding heightened awareness. When the complex challenge of energy management began to overwhelm Lee Kang-kook, the instructor failed to step in decisively. He offered little guidance on managing the plane's speed and descent, and he missed several key mistakes, including the trainee's selection of FLCH SPD mode and the autothrottle's shift into hold mode, both critical errors that went unnoticed and uncorrected. As the plane descended below 500 feet, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The approach had become dangerously unstable, but Lee Jong-min was slow to react, distracted by the mounting cascade of issues. He neglected the formal stabilized approach check, a vital step that would have flagged the need for an immediate go-around. Instead, he allowed himself to believe that Lee Kang-kook could recover the situation, clinging to this hope even as the aircraft plummeted further off course. It wasn't until the plane reached 200 feet that the full gravity of their predicament hit. The PAPI lights were flashing all red, and the airspeed had dropped to a perilously low 120 knots. In that critical moment, the prudent course of action was unmistakable. Call for a go-around and seize control if the trainee didn't comply. But Lee Jong-min hesitated, seemingly still trusting his trainee to correct the situation. This misplaced faith persisted far too long, with precious seconds slipping away. By the time he advanced the thrust levers, just 7 seconds before impact, the die was already cast. Simulations later showed that intervention needed to occur no later than 11 seconds before impact, roughly when the low-speed alert sounded, to have avoided the crash. In the end, Lee Jong-min's failure to act decisively reflected a tragic misjudgment. His belief in his trainee's capacity to recover, compounded by his own distractions and fatigue, allowed the window for a safe recovery to close. The crash became a stark reminder of the immense responsibility borne by instructors, where the margin for error is razor thin, and hesitation can turn a crisis into catastrophe. As the NTSB investigators joined forces with their Korean counterparts, they pored over every fragment of evidence and reconstructed the sequence of events with meticulous precision. What emerged wasn't just a story of pilot error, but a more nuanced tale of design oversight, a ticking time bomb in the Boeing 777's automation system that had lain dormant for nearly 2 decades. At the heart of the matter was a classic case of human factors design gone awry. The Boeing 777's auto throttle system boasted a low-speed protection feature, a safeguard that pilots trusted implicitly, except when it didn't work. Hidden within the system was a rare and largely unknown exception. The low-speed protection would not activate when the auto throttle entered hold mode. This exception, though seldom encountered, created a perfect breeding ground for what aviation experts call an automation surprise. When the unexpected occurs, even seasoned pilots can be caught off guard, startled into hesitation or poor decisions, all while valuable seconds tick away. The crux of the issue was not just the exception itself, but the stealthy way it operated. Few pilots even knew it existed, because there was little reason to encounter hold mode during routine operations, except by accident. And accidents, as this case tragically demonstrated, have a way of happening when least expected. Shockingly, this potential flaw in the system passed unnoticed when the 777 received certification in 1994. Back then, low-speed protection wasn't a mandatory feature, and the issue escaped the rigorous scrutiny it would later attract. It wasn't until 2010, 16 years later, that the design faced a critical test. During the certification of Boeing 787, an FAA test pilot inadvertently stumbled into the same trap. The scenario was eerily prescient. While descending in FLCH SPD mode, the test pilot received a sudden traffic alert, forcing him to take manual control and level off. As he stabilized the aircraft, he noticed with growing alarm that the airspeed was dropping, not just below target speed, but deep into the danger zone. Startled, he manually increased thrust to recover, only to discover that the autothrottle was in hold mode, which had effectively silenced the low-speed protection system. The test pilot immediately flagged this as a glaring vulnerability. An unexpected loss of airspeed protection during a high-stress situation, he argued, could easily lead to disaster. At his insistence, Boeing updated the 787 airplane flight manual, adding a blunt warning. When in hold mode, the AT will not wake up even during large deviations from target speed and does not support stall protection. But the Boeing 777, its manuals remained silent. No similar warning was issued, leaving pilots like Lee Kang-kook unaware of the danger lurking in a system they were trained to trust. It was a sobering oversight, one that the Asiana 214 crash would bring to light in the most devastating way possible. As the investigators pieced together their findings, they realized that this was more than a design flaw. It was a reminder of how the smallest details overlooked can become the catalysts for tragedy. As the NTSB delved deeper into the aftermath of Asiana Airlines Flight 214, they found themselves entangled in a broader debate, one that had been simmering within aviation circles for years. The question at hand was deceptively simple. Was the Boeing 777's automation too complex for its own good? The answers, however, were anything but straightforward. Both the FAA and the European Aviation Safety Agency had flagged the autothrottle's quirks as part of the problem. But among the NTSB investigators, opinions were divided. On one side, some argued that the automation, while intricate, could be mastered with adequate training. After all, there were pilots who understood its nuances perfectly well. On the other side, skeptics contended that no amount of training could fully overcome the risk posed by systems with overlapping modes, obscure exceptions, and intricate if statements that invited misinterpretation. Human error, they cautioned, would always find a way into overly complicated designs. The truth, as the NTSB ultimately concluded, lay somewhere in the middle. Safety, they reasoned, isn't a zero-sum game. The solution wasn't about choosing between better pilot training or simpler systems. It was about achieving both. Manufacturers needed to design systems that were intuitive and transparent, while airlines had to ensure that pilots genuinely understood the tools at their disposal. With this dual objective in mind, the NTSB issued 27 sweeping safety recommendations. They called on the FAA to research improved methods for teaching flight path management, to review the certification of the 777's auto throttle, and to develop robust low-energy warning systems. Asiana Airlines was urged to overhaul its pilot training programs, emphasizing manual flying skills and practical guidance for instructors. Boeing, meanwhile, was pressed to clarify its manuals, explicitly highlight exceptions to speed protection logic, and explore the feasibility of a new, low-energy warning system. These recommendations, however, were only part of the story. The crash of Flight 214 sent shockwaves through the industry, forcing a reckoning over the erosion of basic piloting skills in the age of automation. Policies like Asiana's, which encouraged heavy reliance on automated systems, were now viewed as outdated and dangerous. The shift in perspective was palpable, marking the crash as a pivotal moment in the ongoing effort to restore balance between human and machine. NTSB acting chairman Christopher Hart captured the essence of the issue in a starkly worded statement appended to the final report. Automation has a long history of improving safety and efficiency, he acknowledged. But too much reliance on automation can have unintended consequences. One of those consequences was that this highly experienced pilot with an unblemished record became uncomfortable with manually accomplishing a very basic task, landing on an 11,000-foot runway on a clear day with very little wind. Member Robert Sumwalt took aim at the design side, pointing to a glaring omission in the NTSB's final recommendations. The obvious step, he argued, was for Boeing to redesign the autothrottle's speed protection system. We've seen the consequences of what happens when such a critical safeguard fails pilots in their moment of need. In the end, the crash of Flight 214 was not just a story of human error or mechanical oversight. It was a cautionary tale of how aviation's ever-advancing technology must coexist with the human beings at its controls. When discussing the crash of Asiana Airlines Flight 214 with the general public, one haunting detail often overshadows the technical analysis and the lessons learned. Wasn't that the crash where a girl was run over by a fire truck? It's a question that lingers in the collective memory, demanding to be addressed. In the immediate chaos following the crash, the San Mateo County coroner conducted autopsies on the victims who died at the scene. Both were attributed to multiple blunt injuries, with the manner of death classified as accidental. However, the case of Ye Mengyuan, the young girl tragically crushed by a rescue vehicle, stood apart, casting a shadow of doubt and controversy over the tragedy. The coroner's analysis concluded that Yi Mengyuan was likely alive when Rescue 10 ran over her. His conclusion, though widely cited, was not detailed in the autopsy report, leaving room for speculation. The city of San Francisco, responsible for the fire department operating the vehicle, issued a rebuttal, asserting that she had already succumbed to her injuries prior to being struck. Yet the coroner raised a critical point. The city had a vested interest in the narrative. Legal repercussions loomed large, with lawsuits following the incident. The coroner dismissed the city's claims as the drama of litigation. This clash of interpretations, whether Ye Mengyuan was alive before being struck, underscored the complexities and emotional weight of the aftermath. It wasn't just about forensic evidence. It was about responsibility, perception, and the deeply human desire to understand what went wrong in those chaotic, heart-wrenching moments. In the end, while the technical findings of Flight 214's crash are essential, this tragic human detail remains an indelible part of its story, a painful reminder of the stakes involved when disaster strikes. In the labyrinth of evidence and testimonies surrounding the crash of Asiana Airlines Flight 214, One of the most controversial questions remained unanswered. Was Ye Mengyuan still alive when she was struck by Rescue 10? The NTSB, in its final report, sidestepped a direct verdict, but subtly leaned toward San Francisco's version of events. Their findings painted a chilling picture of her final moments, but the truth remains shrouded in uncertainty. The investigators cited several key pieces of evidence to support the theory that Ye Mengyuan was already deceased when the fire truck rolled over her. Foremost was the coroner's determination that she had suffered a lacerated aorta, a typically fatal injury associated with extreme deceleration, likely sustained when she was thrown from the aircraft at high velocity. Notably, her rib cage showed no signs of crushing, reinforcing the idea that her death occurred before the vehicle's impact. Equally telling was the absence of foreign materials, dust, dirt, or firefighting foam in her trachea. Her body had been buried in these substances before being struck, yet her airways showed no signs of inhalation. Forensic experts noted that if she had been breathing while on the ground, traces of these materials would almost certainly have been found. Further circumstantial evidence pointed to her grim fate. Yi Mengyuan had not been wearing her seatbelt, a detail that likely contributed to her violent ejection from the aircraft. Her seatmate, Wang Linjia, suffered similar injuries consistent with being thrown and dragged across the ground. Unlike the four flight attendants who were ejected while still strapped into their seats and survived, Ye and Wang were hurled free, facing nearly insurmountable odds. No witnesses reported seeing Yi exit the aircraft alive or receiving assistance after the crash. One passenger seated nearby recalled only that Yi was no longer there when she regained consciousness. Yi's parents later filed a lawsuit against the city of San Francisco, relying on the coroner's initial conclusion that she may have been alive. However, no new evidence emerged to support this claim. In a surprising turn, the lawsuit was quietly dropped without a settlement, leaving behind unanswered questions and speculation about the reasons behind their decision. In the shadows of this tragedy, the debate over Ye Mengyuan's fate lingers. The NTSB's evidence suggests one narrative, while the family's legal battle hints at another. The case, like so many in the aftermath of disaster, remains a haunting reminder of the unresolved mysteries that sometimes follow in the wake of catastrophe. The investigation into Ye Mengyuan's fate remains clouded by a persistent contradiction, the coroner's findings versus the evidence outlined in the NTSB report. Even after poring over the details, one cannot say with absolute certainty which narrative is correct. Personally, I lean toward the conclusion that Ye Mengyuan was already deceased when Rescue 10 struck her. But this is a judgment tempered with uncertainty, not one I'd stake my life savings on. Adding to the controversy was the behavior of the firefighters at the scene, which attracted widespread criticism. Their actions, caught on tape, revealed a stark insensitivity. In the privacy of their camaraderie, some personnel made inappropriate comments about Yi Mengyuan's body, remarks that, while common among seasoned first responders hardened by exposure to death, crossed a line when the context became public. Their initial assessment that she was obviously deceased also came under fire. The NTSB report pointed out that video footage showed no immediately apparent external injuries on Yi's body to justify such a conclusion. Compounding this was the lack of basic procedural care. No triage was conducted, no vital signs were checked, and her body was not even covered with a yellow blanket, a standard practice in mass casualty situations to mark the deceased. Then came the ultimate indignity. Regardless of whether Ye Mengyuan was alive or dead, the act of running over her body was an affront to her memory, to her grieving family, and to the solemnity owed to all victims of tragedy. It was an error that should have been avoided at all costs, and one that cast a long shadow over the fire department's handling of the crisis. In the end, this grim chapter is a reminder of how chaos and human error intertwine in disaster. The truth about Ye Mengyuan's final moments may remain elusive, but the lessons about dignity, professionalism, and respect in the aftermath of tragedy are glaringly clear. The crash of Asiana Airlines Flight 214 stands as a story of stark contradictions. Survival clashing with tragedy, humans struggling against automation, and moments of skill overshadowed by fatal missteps. Though the loss of life was minimal compared to the scale of the disaster, the impact of this accident reverberated through the aviation industry, prompting a reevaluation of how pilots and engineers navigate the delicate balance between man and machine. At first glance, some may dismiss the incident as a simple case of pilot error, a failure to land under conditions that seemed almost foolproof. But to do so is to miss the intricate web of factors that underpin the tragedy. Beneath the surface lies a profound and ongoing conversation about safety, technology, and the vulnerabilities of human decision making. Even the NTSB's exhaustive 189-page final report, filled with meticulous analysis, could barely contain the full scope of the philosophical and technical debates that unfolded behind the scenes. This was not just a story of one pilot's misjudgments. It was a cautionary tale about the growing complexities of aviation and the risks of over-reliance on automation. It was a tragedy that revealed uncomfortable truths, not just about the individuals involved, but about the systems they were trained to trust and the blind spots those systems left behind. As time turns this catastrophe into a chapter of history, the story of Flight 214 risks being reduced to sensational headlines and tabloid fodder, an ironic disservice to the lessons it offers. This is more than the tale of a crash. It's a mirror held up to the aviation world, reflecting its strengths, its weaknesses, and the ever-present need for vigilance. By revisiting and retelling this story, I hope to preserve its truths, the uncertainty, the nuance, the uncomfortable reality that accidents are rarely the product of a single failure. They are the sum of many parts, and remembering them in their full complexity is how we ensure the safety of those who fly tomorrow.